this is exactly how I would face my life if I could start over today, with everything I learned too late. Not with promises of happiness, not with self-help formulas, but with the cold truth that has sustained the clear-eyed throughout history. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote that human life swings, like a pendulum, between the pain of wanting and the boredom of having. Most people don't understand this. They believe he's speaking of melancholy, of an embittered philosopher who never really knew how to live. He isn't. He's describing the invisible machinery that moves every conscious existence on Earth. I spent years playing by the given rules, chasing every achievement as if it would finally bring me some peace, without realizing that I was only feeding the same blind motion he had described. Picture a man in New York, sitting in the 40th floor office of a steel and glass tower. 3 months ago, he signed the contract that would change his life. The position he had been chasing since his early 20s finally showed up on his badge. Bigger salary, an office with a view of the Hudson, meetings where his word now carries weight. For a few weeks, he felt something close to fulfillment. He smiled to himself inside the car, bought an expensive watch with no real need, just to mark the moment. Today, 3 months later, he stares at the ceiling of his office in the late afternoon and feels exactly the same emptiness he felt before the promotion. Maybe even bigger. That man is, on some level, all of us. And what he feels has a philosophical name. Schopenhauer, in his masterpiece, The World as Will and Representation, published in 1819, wrote that human life is like a pendulum swinging between pain and boredom. When you desire what you don't have, you suffer from the lack. When you obtain it, you suffer from the emptying out. The small moments between those two ends are what we call happiness. Brief, scarce, always followed by another swing of the pendulum. Happiness, in this arrangement, is not a state, it's an interval, and whoever expects to live inside it expects to live inside a single breath. Most people walk through existence without noticing the mechanism. They believe it's enough to achieve the next thing, the next raise, the next love, and they keep going, year after year, feeling the same frustration right after each achievement. The technical name for this phenomenon, in contemporary psychology, is hedonic adaptation. But Schopenhauer reached the same diagnosis more than 100 years before psychology existed as a science. He simply observed, with the cold calm of someone who refuses to fool himself, what was right in front of everyone. And he formulated the thesis that still unsettles people today. What you call happiness is the brief rest between two sufferings. Before accepting or rejecting such a harsh thesis, it's worth getting to know the person who formulated it. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in 1788 in the port city of Danzig, in what was then Prussia, today the Polish city of Gdańsk. The son of a wealthy merchant and a writer famous in her time, he grew up surrounded by books and trips around Europe. At 17, he wrote in his personal diary a sentence that foreshadowed his entire philosophy. Life is a miserable thing, and he had decided to spend his trying to understand it. That's not the line of a rebellious teenager. That's the line of someone who has already seen, with eyes that have seen too much, what life tends to do to people. He earned his doctorate at 25 with a dissertation titled On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason. 5 years later, still young, he published his masterpiece. The book sold very few copies. It remained forgotten for decades. Schopenhauer grew old trying to teach at a university where he was practically ignored, and only in the last 2 decades of his life was he finally discovered by the European public after the publication of the essays collected in Parerga and Paralipomena in 1851. He died in Frankfurt in 1860, by then recognized as one of the greatest thinkers of his century. He considered Immanuel Kant his absolute master, and he was one of the first European philosophers to seriously study texts from Eastern thought, which had only recently been translated from Sanskrit at the time. His work is, perhaps, the first real bridge between Western thought and the spiritual traditions of Asia. His temperament was difficult. He lived as a recluse with his pet dog, a poodle he called Atma, a Sanskrit word meaning soul. He hated noise, crowds, and the complacent stupidity he saw around him. He even wrote a short essay called On Noise. in which he claims that the amount of noise a person can tolerate without being bothered is inversely proportional to their intellectual capacity. Great thinkers, he said, suffer from everyday racket because their minds operate on a different frequency. People who need loud music all the time are usually running from the silence in which their own mind could finally hear itself. It's important to separate the man from the thinker. His philosophy doesn't spring from personal resentment or some hidden trauma. It springs from observation. He looked at human life with the same detachment a biologist watches a colony of ants, and what he saw gave rise to the most well-founded pessimism in the history of Western philosophy. Anyone who calls him a pessimist forgets that pessimism, in his case, is just the name given to radical honesty. The great question he poses is simple and devastating. Why, with so much material progress, so much technical advancement, so much promise of comfort, does the human being remain, generation after generation, fundamentally dissatisfied? To understand why he claims we suffer, you have to grasp the most important concept in his system. This concept has a simple name and a terrifying consequence: the will. In the original German, Wille. The word is misleading. When Schopenhauer talks about will, he isn't referring to the willpower we use to get up early or finish a project we've been putting off. He's talking about something much deeper, something that comes before everything we think about ourselves. The will, for him, is the inner essence of everything that exists. A blind, irrational, purposeless force that manifests itself in every atom, in every plant, in every animal, and in every human thought. It's the raw impulse of existence. The gravity that pulls a stone to the ground is one face of this will. The instinct that drives the predator to hunt its prey is another face. The desire that drives a man to chase status, money, and meaning is the same force showing up inside a head that thinks. Everything, according to him, is the will manifesting itself in different forms. And here is the point that shatters any comfortable self-image. The human being believes himself to be rational. He has considered himself, for centuries, the animal that thinks. Schopenhauer flips that image. For him, reason is only the shiny surface. Underneath, what truly runs the show is the will. Reason doesn't decide, it justifies. You don't choose first with your mind and then feel. You feel first, you are pulled by this force that precedes consciousness, and then the mind comes in to build a narrative that sounds logical. That's why we defend with such conviction decisions that were really made in the body, in instinct, in desire. Later, philosophers immediately recognized the echo of this insight. An entire psychoanalytic tradition of the 20th century owes an enormous debt to the Schopenhauerian will. A current line of neuroscience, by showing how emotions precede and shape so-called rational decisions, is unknowingly rediscovering in the laboratory what he had already written in the 19th century. The will has no external purpose. It seeks nothing beyond itself. It wants to want. And that's why suffering is structural in human existence. Since the engine driving everything is a blind, infinite wanting, no object can satisfy it permanently. Every satisfaction is a tiny pause in a motion that starts up again right after, with even more force. The human being is the point in nature where this will becomes conscious of itself. And that consciousness, far from setting him free, makes him the only being who suffers not just in the present, but also anticipates future suffering and remembers the past. The philosopher's dog didn't fear death. He did. That's the curse of the animal that thinks. Think, for a moment, about what's going on inside a human body at rest. Even when you're lying down, seemingly still, billions of cells are working non-stop. The heart beats without a command from your consciousness. The lungs fill and empty. The blood circulates. The neurons fire. An unbelievable amount of activity is happening at a microscopic scale, just to keep you alive. That is the will. That anonymous impulse that keeps existence holding itself up. And when you decide something, when you feel hungry, when you go looking for someone, that same force is the one showing up now inside a form that thinks and speaks. You don't control the will. You are one of the forms it takes. This view has immediate practical implications. A man can do what he wants, Schopenhauer wrote, but he cannot want what he wants. You can eat the ice cream you chose, but the desire for the ice cream showed up in you without asking permission. You didn't choose to want that. Behind every conscious decision lies a chain of impulses you never controlled. Recognizing this isn't about taking away anyone's responsibility. It's just about giving consciousness back a little of the humility it has lost in the last few centuries. And what he says next about love and desire is going to change the way you look at every passion for the rest of your life. But first, we need to understand why, in his view, boredom can be even worse than pain. And for that, we need to look at the other side of his work. Schopenhauer didn't only write about the will. His masterpiece is called, literally, the world as will and representation. That second word carries another part of the diagnosis. Everything we perceive is filtered by our mind. Time, space, and causality are not properties of the world in itself. They are lenses through which the world appears to us. Here, Schopenhauer starts from Kant, but goes further. For Kant, the thing in itself, that which exists independently of our perception, was an inaccessible mystery. For Schopenhauer, the thing in itself has a name. It is the will. When you look inside yourself, when you feel hunger, desire, fear, you are in direct contact with this force. The outer world you only know as representation, that is, as a mental image. But the inner world, you are. And what you are, deep down, is the same will that moves everything that exists out there. The existential consequence of this insight is dizzying. We live inside a projection. What we call reality is the movie our psychic apparatus projects 24 hours a day. Even our pleasures are fleeting representations of something we never touch directly. The taste of food, the presence of the person we love, the comfort of money in the bank. All of that is mediated by a cognitive machine that never stops filtering. Once you realize this, two paths open up. The first is despair, yai. The second is a rare kind of peace, which comes from finally understanding why so many things, even beautiful ones, leave an empty taste afterward. With the backdrop understood, it's time to look at the central problem: desire. Schopenhauer is blunt. To desire is, by definition, to lack. Every desire is born from a lack, and that lack is pain. It doesn't matter what the object is. It can be desire for a promotion, for a person, for recognition, for silence, for meaning. In its inner structure, to want something is to feel the absence of that something. And feeling absence, at the most primitive level, is suffering. That's why modern life is so frantic. We are constantly desiring and therefore constantly lacking, and therefore constantly, even if subtly, suffering. The great Schopenhauerian inversion about happiness is right here. For most people, happiness is positive. It's something added to life. Pain is negative. It's something subtracted. Schopenhauer flips that. For him, pain is positive, in the philosophical sense of being real, felt, present. Satisfaction, on the other hand, is negative. It is only the momentary absence of pain. Think of a toothache. While it lasts, it's all there is. When it passes, you don't feel an active pleasure from the absence of pain. You just return to a neutral state. That relief, that return to zero, is what we mistakenly call happiness. Apply this to the life you're living now and the picture gets sharper. The bluish glow of the phone in the dark bedroom at 2 a.m, with your thumb scrolling endlessly after the next hit of something that never arrives. Every notification is a small desire waking up, a small pain. You tap to see what it is, and you get the briefest relief. Then the boredom comes back, and your hand goes to your pocket again. The modern addiction to stimulation is the technological version of the Schopenhauerian diagnosis. Every desire fulfilled gives birth to 10 new ones. The human being, in his words, is an animal that never arrives. The more he gets, the more he wants. The more he wants, the more he suffers. Contemporary studies confirm this structure. Hedonic adaptation research carried out at universities like Harvard and Princeton shows that even extremely positive events like winning the lottery or marrying the person you love produce a boost in well-being for a short period, generally 6 months to a year. After that, the person returns to their previous baseline level of satisfaction. The same goes for serious negative events. The human being adapts. And that adaptation, which evolution gave us as a survival mechanism, is also what makes lasting happiness based on external achievements impossible. A classic 1978 study, today cited in almost every serious book on happiness, compared lottery winners with people who had been in serious accidents and ended up paraplegic. Months after the event, the well-being levels reported by both groups were surprisingly close. Those who had won millions returned to a level of happiness not much different from what they had before. Those who had lost mobility found ways to regain a reasonable sense of meaning and satisfaction. The research shook the naive belief that all you have to do is change external circumstances to change your inner life. Schopenhauer had already written, more than 100 years earlier, that what one is matters far more than what happens to one. This insight changes everything. If happiness doesn't come from circumstances, but from the kind of person you are facing them, then the entire modern race for external improvements may be misdirected. You can change cities, jobs, partners, looks. Within a few months, you'll go back to feeling more or less the way you did before, because the problem was never the circumstance. The problem is the pendulum inside you. And the pendulum only calms down when the person carrying it becomes someone else. That is the Copernican turn of Schopenhauerian philosophy. Stop trying to fix the world out there and start looking at who's in here carrying everything. There's still another tip in the diagnosis. In those rare moments when desire is actually fulfilled, when the object is obtained and the lack ceases, something follows that many people consider worse than pain. Boredom. That grey, empty feeling that shows up after the dream trip, after the professional achievement you waited years for, after the night that was supposed to be perfect. Schopenhauer dedicates entire pages to this phenomenon. For him, boredom reveals something terrible about existence. When desire ceases, what's left isn't happiness. It's emptiness. And that emptiness is unbearable, because it reveals the absence of any intrinsic meaning to life. That's why, according to the philosopher, rich and satiated people are just as bored as poor people suffer from lack. Extreme luxury, absolute leisure, continuous satiety, far from producing peace, produce that heavy grey that describes the lives of so many public figures who had it all. There is a recurring pattern in the biographies of celebrities at the peak of fame who died too soon, under circumstances that still weigh on their stories today. Men who lived inside huge mansions and died with almost no human contact. Stars adored by millions who isolated themselves from the world in the last years of their lives. It wasn't a lack of desires being met. It was the boredom that came after all of them had already been reached. Modern man has learned to flee from boredom with technology. When the emptiness starts to announce itself, he reaches for the phone. 5 hours a day, on average, according to the most recent research on adults in the United States. 5 hours numbing this most dangerous moment of existence, that instant when the will quiets down a little and the emptiness might appear. Series, short videos, games, alcohol, all of these are fillers. Schopenhauer would call them desperate maneuvers to keep the pendulum from reaching the boredom end. Because there, man is forced to face the question he avoids his whole life. What's the point of all this in the end? There's an unsettling detail. The more intelligent a person is, the sooner boredom arrives. People with slower minds can keep themselves occupied for longer with little. People with quick minds exhaust the stimulation right away. That's why, Schopenhauer observes, it's precisely the most lucid who most need inner resources to bear existence. For them, the unexamined life is literally unbearable. And it's perhaps here that philosophy stops being an intellectual luxury and becomes a survival tool. Without a cultivated inner life, the lucid person succumbs to their own lucidity. With it, they can find a way to inhabit the pendulum without being ground up by its motion. Schopenhauer didn't limit himself to describing suffering. He took a head-on attack at one of the most widespread ideas of the philosophical optimism of his time. The famous formula according to which we live in the best of all possible worlds, defended by thinkers of the German Enlightenment. God, being perfect, would have chosen out of all imaginable worlds the one with the greatest possible good. Wars, diseases, injustices, all of that would be part of a plan whose totality is good, even if our parts of it look bad. Schopenhauer demolished that thesis with an argument of brutal simplicity. This is, in fact, the worst of all possible worlds. And the argument is direct. If this world were a little worse, in any respect, it could no longer exist. If the average temperature of the Earth were just a few degrees higher, life wouldn't be possible. If food were just a little scarcer, beings would go extinct. If suffering were 1 degree higher, no one would endure it. We are walking on the edge of a razor. This is the minimum viable world, the one in which pain is only bearable enough for beings to keep reproducing and perpetuating the will. Anything worse would no longer be. Therefore, this is the real worst. Optimism, according to him, is a cruel form of mockery in the face of the world's real pain. To tell someone who has lost a child that everything is part of a good plan is, deep down, indifference disguised as faith. Connect this to what's going on now. Today, there's an entire culture of mandatory positivity, phrases in big letters on social media, ordering people to always keep a positive attitude. People saying that all you have to do is smile, and the universe will conspire in your favor. That whole industry of superficial well-being is a modern version of the same optimism Schopenhauer fought against. And the problem with it is what he already pointed out. It forbids real pain from existing. Whoever is suffering is forced to pretend they're fine, because admitting suffering is, according to this culture, a personal failure, a lack of winner's mindset. The psychological consequences of this imposition are serious. The most recent research from the American Psychological Association shows a continuous rise in anxiety and emotional breakdowns among young adults in developed countries. We have never had so many resources, so many options, so much abundance, and we have never gotten so psychologically sick. Schopenhauer would not be surprised. For him, this paradox is exactly what you'd expect from a civilization that denied pain instead of trying to understand it. Think of the strange silence of a Sunday afternoon when the week is already over and the next one hasn't started yet. That moment when you've already scrolled the phone until you're tired of it, you've already watched movies without holding your attention, and something still nags inside you with no name. That nagging, that so many people rush to muffle with more stimulation, is what Schopenhauer wanted us to look in the eye. Not to suffer more, but to finally understand what he was describing. Understanding philosophy is interesting. Practicing philosophy can change your life. Start with the link I left in the first pinned comment. There is a chapter of Schopenhauer's work that still provokes discomfort today, perhaps more now than in his time. It's in The World as Will and Representation, in the second volume, and it's called The Metaphysics of Sexual Love. In it, the philosopher applies his system to the most celebrated phenomenon of human experience, romantic love, and what he says is brutal. What we call love is not, in essence, an individual feeling between two people. It is the will of the species acting through individuals to secure the next generation. The overwhelming passion is the biological disguise that ensures the continuation of the human species. When you fall in love with someone, according to Schopenhauer, it isn't exactly you doing the choosing. It is the will of the species, hidden behind your eyes, calculating which individual, paired with you, would produce more fit offspring. The intense attraction to specific traits, facial symmetry, physical vigor, characteristics that complement yours, is the way the species uses the individual as a vehicle for its own perpetuation. What feels like destiny, like that one person in the world, is mechanism. Individual consciousness is just the stage where the play of the species is performed. That, Schopenhauer observes, is why the disenchantment after the conquest. That's why so many passions cool off within a few years. That's why boredom in long relationships, even when all the rational pieces are in place. Once the function of the will of the species has been fulfilled, it loses interest in the individual. Nature wasn't made for the happy couple lasting decades on end. It was made to produce descendants. Everything that comes after is, in large part, conscious human effort to artificially sustain what biology no longer sustains on its own. It isn't cynicism. It's brutal honesty about why we suffer so much precisely in love, in the very territory that promised to be the opposite of suffering. Contemporary researchers at universities like the University of Texas at Austin have spent decades studying how patterns of attraction repeat across cultures. The results largely confirm that these patterns are shaped by deep reproductive pressures. None of this takes away the beauty of conscious, devoted, chosen love. But it shows that the biological basis of falling in love is more primitive than we'd like to admit, and that confusing this basis with the whole of love is a recipe for chronic disappointment. Whoever expects the initial passion to last forever is waiting for the will of the species to keep being interested in someone it has already used. There's an even more unsettling detail in this analysis. The more intense the initial passion, the deeper the later disenchantment tends to be. Because the intensity of falling in love is proportional to how effectively the will of the species used those two individuals for its own ends. People who fall in love moderately tend to build more stable relationships. People who live through great passions tend to live through also great emptiness. It's not a coincidence. It's the same force acting in two phases. First it pushes, then it lets go. What's left between those two phases is everything the couple was able to build consciously, outside the territory of biological passion. Schopenhauer doesn't deny that there can be, in human love, something beyond the reproductive drive, but he insists that this something has to be deliberately built, with conscious choice, with real friendship, with intellectual complicity, all things that have little to do with the whirlwind of the first month of a relationship. The couples who grow old together happily aren't the ones who had the most intense passion. They're the ones who managed, after the passion calmed down, to find a more sober and lasting form of companionship. That transition, not very glamorous, is what sustains real love. And it's exactly what modern romantic culture, with its romantic comedies and its obsessive ballads, teaches you not to look for. In another crucial essay titled On the Vanity and Suffering of Life, Inside Parerga and Paralipomena, Schopenhauer takes a step back and looks at human existence as a whole. Life, he writes, is a task that fulfills itself without any external purpose. We are born, we want, we suffer, we die. And while that happens, all of humanity runs after status, money, approval, pleasure, like ants in an anthill seen from above. Each one certain that its mission is the most important, each one destined to disappear without leaving a permanent trace. Look for a moment at the crowd in a big city at lunchtime. Times Square in New York, Shibuya in Tokyo. Thousands of people crossing at the same time, each one with their own story, their own worries, their own urgencies. And consider that, in 100 years, virtually none of them will be remembered. The titles chased, the dramas, the achievements, all silenced by time. Schopenhauer doesn't write this to induce despair. He writes it to invite lucidity. What really matters when you see all this from above? What part of your daily agitation would survive that distant look? The answer isn't nihilism. The answer is an inner reorientation. If nothing you chase as urgent survives the broader perspective, maybe it's worth choosing better what you chase. Maybe the rush doesn't justify the small life. Maybe the importance given to other people's opinions, to the number of followers, to a career taken as identity, is disproportionate to reality. The vanity of existence in this reading isn't a sentence, it's a liberation. Whoever has seen that a lot of things don't matter can finally take care of the little that does. And here appears one of the most misunderstood themes in the philosopher: solitude. Schopenhauer wrote in a famous aphorism that one can only be entirely oneself when one is alone. Whoever loves the crowd, according to him, has nothing inside. The line is harsh and easy to interpret as misanthropy, but the fairer reading is another. What he says is that the constant presence of others imposes a permanent filter on what we are. We adapt the way we talk, the topics of interest, the publishable opinions. The person who keeps seeing themselves reflected in other people's eyes ends up becoming only that reflection. Without solitude, there is no return to oneself. the hyper-connected life has created a brutal paradox. We have never been so virtually accompanied, and we have never had so little inner silence. The phone next to the bed, notifications in the bathroom, the audio during the walk, the show during the meal. Real solitude, the kind in which the mind can find itself without distraction, has become rare, and its absence has measurable consequences. Recent research on mental health shows a clear correlation between the inability to be alone and increased anxiety. Schopenhauer would recognize this right away. For him, the person who can't stand their own company is the one who hasn't yet built anything worthwhile inside. There is a cost, it's true. The person who cultivates solitude and deep thought tends to feel out of place in ordinary settings. Shallow conversations start to sound painful. Big parties become exhausting. Relationships built only on entertainment lose their appeal. Social awkwardness in these cases isn't a defect. It can be a symptom of depth. Schopenhauer wrote for that kind of person. For the reader who has always felt like a foreigner in their own world, who looks at the conversations of their co-workers and can't bring themselves to care, who prefers a night at home with a book to a happy hour with 20 people. To that reader, he offers something more valuable than company. He offers dignity. But we need to make a distinction here that deserves attention. Chosen solitude is different from painful isolation. Schopenhauer doesn't defend the second. The person who feels lonely despite being surrounded by people, who suffers from the lack of deep connection, isn't living the Schopenhauerian solitude. They're living its exact opposite, the crowd internalized that never leaves them in peace. True solitude begins when a person stops needing the other as a mirror and starts inhabiting themselves naturally. It's work. It takes time. And it requires confronting first all the discomfort that comes up when the silence finally settles. That initial discomfort is the hardest part. Whoever has never been alone with their own thoughts discovers, in the first few minutes of real silence, that those thoughts aren't exactly pleasant. Up come postponed guilts, old fears, feelings of inadequacy that had been silenced by the noise of the world. Most people, on hitting that, run. They grab the phone, turn on the TV, call someone. Whoever keeps going, whoever accepts crossing that first desert, discovers afterwards something few people know. Behind the discomfort, a field of calm appears. Your own company, once heavy, slowly becomes tolerable. Then, pleasant. Then, indispensable. Whoever gets there can't turn back. They know now that solitude isn't punishment, it's territory. There is a passage in Aphorisms on the wisdom of life that may be the most useful one in his entire work for everyday life. Schopenhauer divides everything that makes up the fate of a human being into 3 distinct planes, which separate those who live well from those who live badly. The first plane is what one is. Character, health, temperament, intellectual capacity, sensitivity, everything that belongs to the person in themselves, regardless of external circumstances. The second plane is what one has. Goods, money, property, material resources. The third is what one represents. The image in other people's eyes, prestige, reputation, fame. For him, human happiness depends, in decreasing order, on these 3 spheres. What one is worth more than what one has, and both are worth more than what one represents. A rich and sick man is unhappier than a poor and healthy one. A famous and bitter man is unhappier than a serene unknown. The modern inversion of these planes is one of the roots of contemporary unhappiness. We live in a culture in which what one represents has become the main axis. People build identities on social media, chase visibility, suffer over likes, measure their own worth by the image they project. And at the same time, they neglect the most fundamental plane, the plane of who they actually are when no one is watching. The consequence is predictable. Whoever invests in the image lets the essence shrink. And when the image inevitably falls apart, because algorithms change, because youth fades, because the position ends, because the trend moves on, what's left is someone who didn't cultivate anything inside. Schopenhauer would call that figure absolutely poor. Poor not in the material sense, but in the sense of what really matters. The opposite path is available to anyone who wants it. Cultivate what one is. Read, think, refine your character, strengthen your body, develop real intellectual capacities, build an inner life that no one can erase. That plane is the only one no one can take away from you, because no one but you can build it in your place. Before moving on to the ways out Schopenhauer offers, we have to face the biggest objection ever made to his philosophy, and it came from a philosopher who grew up admiring him before turning against him. Friedrich Nietzsche accused Schopenhauer of turning renunciation into a virtue, of making suffering into wisdom, of elevating weakness in the face of life to the level of philosophy. For Nietzsche, that pessimism was a sophisticated form of surrender. Life should be affirmed with all its pain, not denied. The strong man embraces the pendulum, dances on it, turns it into creation. The weak man complains about the pendulum and proposes silencing it. That criticism shook generations of readers who, after Nietzsche, began looking at Schopenhauer with suspicion. The objection is serious and deserves an answer. But the Schopenhauerian answer is simpler and deeper than it seems. It isn't a matter of surrendering in the face of life. It is a matter of seeing the machinery before operating it. The man who dances on the pendulum without knowing he's on a pendulum dances like a puppet, thinking he chooses the movements. He celebrates his own slavery as freedom. The lucid one, on the other hand, still dances, but with awareness. And that awareness, far from taking away vitality, is the only thing that can turn movement into act. Schopenhauer doesn't ask you to stop living. He asks you to live with your eyes open. The difference between those two positions is, deep down, the difference between serving a sentence and inhabiting a life. The one who walks knowing the terrain isn't weaker than the one who walks blind. They're just less likely to fall into holes they could have avoided. In another important essay titled On the Basis of Morality and written in 1840, Schopenhauer rejects the morality of abstract duty and proposes another ethical foundation: compassion. For Kantian philosophy, acting morally meant obeying duty, the inner moral law, the categorical imperative. Schopenhauer considers that morality cold and abstract. For him, the true foundation of good action isn't duty performed, but the capacity to feel the suffering of another as if it were your own. When you see someone in pain and something tightens inside you, right there is the root of ethics. But why do we feel that? Here comes the metaphysical leap. For Schopenhauer, behind the appearances, all of us are manifestations of the same single will. The differences between people are surface representations. The essential identity is the same. When you hurt someone, you hurt something that, ultimately, is also you. That's why compassion is more than a moral feeling. It is ontological recognition. The compassionate person is, without knowing it, perceiving the deep unity of reality. The cruel person is fooled by the surface that makes them believe the other is just another. This intuition brings Schopenhauer closer to ancient spiritual traditions, both from Eastern roots and from the mystical strands of medieval Christianity, which he read with admiration. The contemporary application is powerful. We live in a culture that glamorizes cynicism, light-hearted indifference, distant irony in the face of others' suffering. Being compassionate is confused with being weak, with being sentimental, with not knowing how the world works. Schopenhauer would flip that judgment on the spot. Being compassionate for him is a philosophical act of high caliber. It is seeing more deeply. It is perceiving, beneath the surface differences, the common suffering that ties all conscious beings together. In an age when most interactions have been reduced to sharp comments on social media, recovering the real capacity for compassion is, at the same time, a spiritual practice and a form of cultural resistance. Schopenhauer extended compassion to animals as well, in an age when that was practically unheard of in European philosophy. For him, the suffering of non-human beings was just as real as ours, because they too are manifestations of the same will that feels. He attacked with ferocity the Cartesian tradition that saw animals as machines without feelings. He was one of the first Western philosophers to defend, with solid metaphysical arguments, what today we'd call the animal cause. That inner consistency makes his ethics one of the most complete ever formulated. Whoever is capable of seeing the brother in the suffering human and also in the suffering animal is close to what he understood as moral wisdom. Compassion, in that sense, isn't weakness. It is a sophisticated form of intelligence. It is the ability to step outside your own point of view, feel what the other is feeling, act with that in mind. In work environments, in families, in communities, on social media, that ability is becoming rare. Social psychology research at American universities like the University of Michigan shows a measurable decline in empathy among college students over the last decades. That's not good news. A society that loses empathy loses, deep down, its ability to recognize itself as humanity. Think about the reheated dinner eaten in front of the laptop, alone, with a recorded meeting playing in the background and the phone buzzing with notifications on the counter next to you. That scene, repeated millions of times every night in apartments in big cities, is the exact opposite of what Schopenhauer would prescribe. It crushes, in a single moment, true solitude, real contemplation, presence to oneself. And yet it has been normalized as an acceptable routine. With the diagnosis understood and the ethical axis offered, a practical question arises. How, then, to live? Schopenhauer doesn't leave us to the pain. He points out concrete paths for reducing suffering. The first, perhaps the most beautiful, is art. The aesthetic experience, according to him, has an almost metaphysical function. When you genuinely contemplate a work of art, something curious happens. For those few seconds, your individual desire ceases. You aren't wanting anything for yourself anymore. You are just seeing. You are contemplating the pure idea manifesting itself in that sensory form. In that moment of disinterested contemplation, you temporarily step outside the pendulum. The inner engine goes quiet. What's left is a peace that doesn't come from having gotten something, but from having stopped for a moment, the wanting. That's why the true aesthetic experience is so rare and so precious. It isn't entertainment. It isn't distraction. It isn't the short video that scrolls endlessly while the mind stays restless. It is real, slow, attentive contemplation. Schopenhauer recommends it as an almost spiritual practice. Seek out some contact with real beauty every day. In front of a great classical painting, observed for minutes and not seconds, something stops inside whoever looks with true attention. But Schopenhauer keeps a door slightly open in the final pages of his masterpiece, and it may be the most radical of all. Before we get to it, we have to cross the most brilliant ground of his aesthetics, the one he himself considered the highest point of human experience. Among the arts, one is elevated above all the others: music. For him, music does not represent ideas, the way painting or poetry does. Music represents the will itself. It is the only art that touches directly the bottom of the reel. That's why a melody can make you cry without your knowing why. That's why a harmony can bring peace where no words can reach. Music speaks of what we are, without conceptual mediation. Schopenhauer writes that if we could translate into words what a symphony says, we would have true philosophy. Nietzsche, deeply influenced by this idea even after breaking with Schopenhauer on other points, would later write that life without music would be a mistake. The practical application is simple and almost revolutionary. Listening to music, really listening, has become rare. Music today is the soundtrack to something else. It plays in the background while you work, while you cook, while you cross the street. Rarely is it the sole object of attention. Schopenhauer would invite you to the opposite practice. Set aside time to listen to a whole piece in silence, doing nothing but listening. Close your eyes. Let the melody come in. Allow what is deepest inside you to resonate with what is being said without words. That practice is, in the literal sense, therapeutic. It reduces the will. It gives back something the overstimulated life has taken away. There is a concrete example worth mentioning. The Goldberg Variations by Johann Sebastian Bach, written in 1741, are often cited as one of the musical experiences that comes closest to what Schopenhauer described as pure contemplation. Whoever listens to that piece in its entirety, with full attention, often reports a sensation hard to describe, as if time was suspended, as if desire shut off, as if, for those minutes, it were possible to exist without wanting absolutely anything. There is yet a more radical path, described in the final part of The World as will and representation. Schopenhauer calls it the negation of the will. It is not suicide, which he explicitly rejects as a way out. Suicide, for him, is just frustrated will turning against itself. It doesn't negate the will. It only eliminates its particular object. The true negation is something else. It is the progressive silencing of wanting, the path of the ascetic, of the contemplative, of the one who, by deeply understanding the nature of the will, stops blindly obeying it. Not that they stop existing, they just stop being pulled by infinite desire. Schopenhauer finds this path described in several traditions simultaneously, from the mystical strands of medieval Christianity to the schools of Eastern spiritual thought he studied so much. In all of them, there is a common insight. Suffering is born from attachment. Letting go of attachment is reducing suffering, not eliminating it entirely, because the body still feels pain, but reducing that deep layer of suffering that comes from wanting things to be different from what they are, accepting the real, consciously renouncing some desires, cultivating the silence of wanting. That is the most advanced path of Schopenhauerian philosophy. For the contemporary reader, who probably isn't going to join a monastery, there is a practical version of this path. Start reducing, in your day-to-day life, the number of automatic desires. That item that shows up in an ad, and that 5 minutes earlier you didn't know existed. That notification that pulls you into a scroll that lasts 40 minutes. That ambition you inherited from your environment without ever asking whether it's really yours. Every small renunciation is an exercise in not blindly obeying the will. Every hour without the phone is a microscopic negation. These gestures, added up, slowly build something rare. A life less pulled from outside. A life with some kind of center. There is a Buddhist concept that helps to understand this practice. Contemplatives from Eastern traditions speak of letting go. Not an angry refusal of the world. Not a moralistic escape. Letting go. The ability to pick something up, use it, hand it back without clinging to it. Walking through life without closing your fist over every experience. Schopenhauer would recognize this immediately. Most modern suffering comes from the habit of closing the fist. You want so badly for this to happen that you suffer at the possibility that it won't. When it happens, you want so badly for it to keep happening that you suffer at the possibility of it ending. Letting the fist open doesn't mean not living. It means living without that constant tension that turns every good thing into a potential future loss. Modern neuroscience confirms, in its own way, part of this intuition. Research conducted by institutions like the Mind and Life Institute, founded in collaboration with Buddhist masters, has shown that regular contemplative practices produce measurable changes in the brain. Areas associated with emotional reactivity become less active. Areas associated with conscious regulation become more robust. People who have been meditating for years don't become numb. They just stop being so easily dragged around by their own emotions. Schopenhauer, with no neuroscience at his disposal, intuited the same thing. The progressive negation of the will doesn't erase life. It just gives back a little space between impulse and action. And in that space, freedom lives. Think about the bus stuck in traffic, the rain running down the window, and the rare instant when no one is talking to you, no notification is calling, and your mind is just there, watching the drops. That kind of minute, once considered a waste, is what Schopenhauer would call an exercise in reducing the will. It isn't a glamorous event. It doesn't become a social media post, but it is exactly the kind of moment when the machinery slows down for an instant and something that looks like serenity can come in. The moment has come for philosophy to come down from the heights and touch the ground of life. It is time to pull everything together into practical advice that fits the everyday. The first piece is the hardest. Reduce expectations instead of increasing achievements. Modern culture teaches the opposite. Dream bigger, go further, want more. Schopenhauer points to the opposite path, and with good reasons. Whoever reduces expectations reduces, by the same measure, the distance between what is desired and what is real, which is precisely where suffering lives. It doesn't mean abandoning life. It means stopping demanding from it what it structurally cannot give. The second piece of advice is to cultivate the inner life. As we already saw in the division of planes, what one is worth more than what one has or represents. Invest in serious reading, in your own thinking, in capacities you carry with you regardless of circumstances, in physical health, which Schopenhauer considered the material basis of everything, in cultivated artistic sensitivity, in mastery of some difficult craft, everything that enriches the person on the inside and that can't be taken away by a layoff, a betrayal, an economic crisis. That is real wealth, in the oldest philosophical sense of the term. The third piece of advice concerns relationships. Prefer quality solitude over shallow company, not in the sense of avoiding people, but in the sense of choosing better. Schopenhauer said that most company costs more than it offers because it forces you to waste time and mental energy on conversations that don't add anything. On the other hand, good company, someone with an active mind and solid character, is worth a lot. And well-inhabited silence is worth a lot too. The criterion for him is simple. Step away from any situation that impoverishes you and stay close to what enriches you. And learn not to be afraid of being alone, because without that capacity, you become hostage to anyone. The fourth point is to accept suffering as a given of existence, not as a personal failure. This is, perhaps, the most important liberation. We live in a culture in which suffering is treated as a symptom of something wrong that needs to be fixed. Sadness is treated as a disease to be eliminated. Dissatisfaction is seen as a deficiency. Schopenhauer offers another reading. Suffering is part of the structure of conscious life. It isn't a flaw, it is a condition. When you stop feeling guilty for suffering, something loosens up. Life becomes lighter, paradoxically, the moment you accept that it is heavy. The great Schopenhauerian promise, and perhaps the only one he really delivers on, is serenity. Not happiness, not euphoria, not success. Serenity. That rare state of someone who watches the pendulum move, notices that it is moving, and even so is no longer blindly dragged along by it. Someone who feels the desire arrive and recognizes it as desire. Someone who feels the boredom show up and recognizes it as boredom. Someone who observes the game of the will inside themselves with the same calm with which you watch the weather outside. That person hasn't escaped the world. They have just stopped identifying themselves entirely with everything happening inside it. And here, at the end, perhaps it is honest to admit what this philosophy offers and what it doesn't. It doesn't offer lasting happiness, because it knows that doesn't exist. It doesn't offer quick fixes, because it is suspicious of every quick fix. It doesn't offer cheap consolation, because cheap consolation is part of the mechanism that makes people sick. What it offers is something much rarer, an honest way to inhabit existence, without illusions and without despair, with open eyes and a calm heart, recognizing pain, loss, emptiness, boredom, without running from them, and without being destroyed by them. That balance, Schopenhauer would call wisdom. Life may very well be a pendulum between pain and boredom, but there is a place outside the pendulum. It's the place of the one who watches. Seeing the machinery is the beginning of not being ground up by it. Schopenhauer doesn't console us with lies. He arms us with the truth. And paradoxically, it is in that hard truth that many people find, for the first time in their lives, something that looks like peace. Next week, observe the pendulum in yourself. Notice when the desire arrives. Notice when the boredom shows up. And remember, in that moment, that you are no longer the one living inside it blindly. You are the one who sees. And the one who sees is already, in some measure, free. If this text moved you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel to keep going on this philosophical journey. and consider becoming part of our members club, where we dive deeper into each of these themes with exclusive material. Serenity doesn't come by chance. It comes from continuous practice, and practicing together makes all the difference.